Welcome to another episode of the Brighter Web Podcast, insights on growing a small business using the latest technology and marketing best practices. I'm your co-host, Robert, and that's the other co-host right over there.
Hey, I'm Mickey. Good to be here, Robert.
So we're going to, in this episode, look at two of the most common forms of marketing, inbound and outbound marketing.
So let's just start right there. What do you mean by inbound and outbound? What do those terms actually do?
So outbound is essentially pushing marketing messages out to an audience. You're outbounding those messages. So you're going to channels where people already are and you're broadcasting to a larger group with your business's message. Inbound, on the other hand, flips that by trying to attract people back to your marketing channels. You create marketing channels like blogs and podcasts, and then you try to use that content to try to attract people back. It's about creating content that people can find and then willingly, voluntarily entering your business's marketing funnel.
Gotcha. Okay, you mentioned a few, but can you give me a couple examples of each, what that really means?
Outbound marketing is a little bit more traditional. That's what's been around and what we tend to think of marketing in the more traditional long-term sense. So it's things like paid advertising, or sponsoring a conference, having a booth at a trade show, or sending direct mail pieces, or even just cold calling people. On the other hand, inbound marketing is more new and digital. Like, the internet has allowed us to do a lot more of the inbound marketing things because we're able to create our own platforms. So things like blogging, creating free resources for lead generators, using email automation to nurture people within a marketing funnel, creating free educational webinars. Obviously, like I mentioned, this podcast is a version of inbound marketing. And a quick way to summarize that and think about it is outbound marketing is really pushing your brand to people where they are. And inbound marketing is pulling people back to your brand.
Yeah, and I think of outbound too really as interruption based. You're getting in their face and say, hey, stop what you're doing and listen to us right now, which I'm okay with that in some cases. Like if I'm watching TV, I know there's going to be ads during the football game. Like I expect that, that's okay. Cold calling and other things, spam email, that's outbound marketing, but it's a little shadier. But it's interrupting people versus inbound is just being there when they search or they want to find someone, that they'll find you and you'll be the answer for them. Is that a fair way to put it?
Absolutely, yes. That's, again, like you're saying, that's not always the case, but that is typically how we think about it. And that's typically how it actually interacts with people. That yes, outbound marketing a lot of times has its effectiveness and has its pros for sure, but it tends to be more interruption based.
So what are some other differences between the two different approaches?
Yeah, like we've said, outbound marketing is a lot more traditional. That's what's been around for a lot longer. Obviously, it's much easier to jump on somebody else's platform. If you've got a TV channel, we know how many people are going to be watching the Super Bowl, and so we can say, hey, can we just borrow that audience for a little while? You've got several million eyeballs who are watching this thing, who are on your platform. We just will pay you X amount of dollars in order to borrow that audience. It typically, for that reason, is able to reach a much bigger audience because it's an existing platform, but it's also very broad, so it's not as targeted as inbound could be. It's usually really good for building brand awareness because typically it's people who aren't already knowledgeable about your brand. And it usually can have a lot more immediate impact because you're finding people who aren't aware of your brand. You're trying to push them towards something immediate. And something like paid advertising, it's not whether or not you're going to get in front of somebody. No, you've paid for this Super Bowl ad. You're going to show up. And anybody who's watching the Super Bowl at that moment is going to see your brand.
Yeah, I like the word you put, that you borrow their audience. You
Yeah.
find someone that has an existing audience, whether it's a magazine or a TV show or even inventory in Google Ads or whatever, and just say, hey, I want to pay to borrow that audience from it and speak my message to them. That's a neat way to put it.
That's absolutely it. And that's one of the reasons why things like media platforms are able to sell that, is because, like, hey, all they've done is essentially gathered a bunch of people together and then they're inviting advertisers and sponsors in to utilize that audience. Inbound is a little bit different because it's definitely newer. It's relying on a lot more of the digital marketing technologies, things like Google, things like social media that have been built up in the digital space. And typically the goal and the aim of inbound marketing is to provide value and to provide, hey, this is why you should come listen to us, to a more targeted audience, and then nurture them towards trusting your brand and saying, hey, we have this podcast, it's really cool, you can trust us. But also, by the way, we have this product over here that if you're interested in this podcast or interested in this blog that you're reading, you'll probably also benefit from this book that we wrote or this service that we provide. So it's about wooing and dating a smaller audience that more connected to your brand and providing them value in a more immediate way. So this is a much slower process. It can take time to build up that trust, to build up that content, but it typically has a much higher ROI because exactly who you're targeting, and you're not having to just pay out a huge lump of cash to whoever's broadcasting the Super Bowl or whoever has built up that audience.
Gotcha. So you've convinced me on both of them. So help me out. Which one is better, or is one better than the other?
No. I mean, I think honestly, it depends on what your industry is. There are some people that really, McDonald's and Coca-Cola and AT&T, they're going to benefit a lot more from just getting a big audience. They have brand awareness. They have the resources to be able to pay into traditional outbound marketing. But typically, they're going to do a little bit of both. And most businesses probably should consider doing a little bit of both. If you're a small business, you're not going to have the dollars to do big time TV advertising, but advertising in a local magazine or a newspaper or something like that, and in a smaller scale is still very good. You still want to have a mix of both to truly be effective. Maybe your balance is a little bit off. If you're a smaller business, maybe you're doing 75% inbound marketing and 25% outbound versus probably the inverse of that for some of the bigger corporation and businesses that I mentioned. But it really depends on your industry, but ultimately you should have a combination of the two because one is not inherently better than the other. There are pros and cons for both approaches.
Gotcha. So is this the two choices I have then, inbound, outbound? Is there any other angle to consider?
These are certainly the two most popular and ones that are most well recognized. I had the crazy idea that maybe there's a few more out there, and the one that I wrote a blog post about a couple of years ago that I called outlandish marketing. So it's a little bit different from both. And that's really one, you've thrown ROI out the window, so you definitely don't want to rely on this one completely because this is just if you have the bandwidth and the creativity to add something on top of inbound and outbound marketing, because really there are some businesses that do things that really don't directly benefit their marketing, don't really directly benefit their underlying business. Some examples of that are the Guinness Book of World Records, the Michelin restaurant stars, and then Domino's campaign that they had about 10 years ago called Paving for Pizza. Those are some examples of outlandish marketing.
Explain why the Michelin restaurant stars is outlandish for those that don't know the story behind that.
Yeah, well, each one has a story behind it, but
well, yeah.
So the Michelin stars, if you're familiar with fine dining, those are basically awards given out to some of the top, fancy restaurants around the world, and that started because it's the Michelin tire company, right? You're familiar with the company that makes tires, and so what do they have to do with connecting to restaurants? Well, they realized in France back in the early, turn of the century, the early 1900s, that people weren't really traveling that much. Cars were a relatively new technology, and people were a little afraid of them, and so they only traveled short distances, and that didn't wear down the tires fast enough for them to have a good business. So Michelin set out to create a guidebook initially around France to say, hey, you should travel south of the country to visit this fine hotel and this fine restaurant, to encourage people to drive further and to wear down their tires more, and then they would need to buy new tires. And so it basically spawned from there to, okay, now they're going to add more countries and guides to other local establishments, including restaurants. And so that it grew from there into this very, very well-known thing, but the ultimate goal of it was to get people to use their cars and to wear down their tires. Yeah. So there's a very indirect and not intuitive way to think about it, but it worked really well. And obviously Michelin is a huge tire company now, and their guidebook that includes reviews of restaurants is very well known and very highly regarded.
For sure. Yeah, that one, if you get into Guinness too, the first thing I always thought of, that's funny, it's named like the beer company, and actually it was the beer company trying to do more things there. And then Domino's Paving for Pizza. I would almost consider that more outbound because they used it to push across, but it was still just a crazy thing they did. I never saw them paving our road, but the idea they would do that to give you a smooth pizza delivery is just outlandish, is a good way to put it, and crazy enough that it caught on. So great examples.
And that's a good point. A lot of these, especially today, the Guinness and the Michelin examples are from about 100 years ago, so they're a little bit older, and the forms of advertising were different then. But today it's sometimes you do that in order to then fuel both your inbound and outbound marketing. It's more of an idea and an approach. But the Guinness Book of World Records one was also they wanted to settle some like beer bets that people were having as they were discussing over their pint of Guinness.
Yep.
And so they created a book that like pulled together all the world records to give guys something to talk about when they're drinking their beer. It's another just example that is indirect, but it's a fun way to promote your business and your brand.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So, and obviously we will have more examples and maybe links to some of this information in the show notes
Great idea.
for this episode.
For sure.
So if you have been, thank you for listening to this episode of the Brighter Web Podcast, brought to you by GreenMellen, a digital marketing agency. To help your business keep up with the latest digital marketing trends, check us out at greenmellen.com. You can also find show notes and more episodes at abrighterweb.com.